Good evening, all. Yeah, look at the combat. We've got combat going on here. Did I say space combat? I mean canine combat.
We need the Star Trek music. We need the Star Trek fight music.
I know, right? I know. God damn. Now they're just playing. How are you guys doing tonight?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Good, pretty good.
Yeah, no, all's good. You watched Launch today?
I did.
Absolutely.
Pretty cool.
Very much. It was nice to see something good happening.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. It was, but and I was, we ended in the middle of Pence's little speech there after the liftoff. I was like, okay, this is just not working for me. So I was surprised, we had a little canine combat going on.
Apparently.
So.
There you go.
Well, good. So, I tell you, it was nice to see America get back in space, and not just an American launch, but like new way of going to space, new rocket, new capsule. A major step. I mean, because even you say, oh well, we launched the space shuttle 9 years ago, right? With like 30-year-old technology.
Yeah.
Right. So it was nice to see, look inside that capsule and look at everything and going, wow, damn, man.
It was pretty impressive to see that booster land on the boat.
Damn, that's insane.
Yeah.
That was surely insane. So,
yeah.
But all good. We had Dave Alexander, NASA flight surgeon and Axanar fan, give us the play-by-play. So
cool.
Yeah, he's working on the mission, but he's based in Houston, and his job was contingency. So as long as nothing went wrong, he didn't have anything to do.
Okay.
And he said something like, once they dock with the station, he's done.
Yeah,
he gets to go home.
Yeah, so he's primary on Artemis, the next, which he's saying that NASA's planning on landing in the moon in 4 years. I'm like, what?
I heard that today as well, but I had missed the details. I wasn't listening when someone was saying something important. So
yeah, they're talking. That's one of the reasons why they it was sort of surprising that Boeing didn't get picked for one of the 3 lander designs, because the Boeing one is arguably the one that's easiest for them to do. It's just a matter of throwing enough money at it, whereas the other ones are sort of like trying to do something a little bit different, etc. Like, I mean, the SpaceX proposal is to use a special version of Starship to do it, which is like, that thing hasn't even flown yet.
A special version of what?
Of the Starship, of the SpaceX one, and it's a different version. It's not designed to do a reentry. It would be a space-only version, and they'd have to do 2 launches because they have to refuel it. It can't get to the moon without being refueled in Earth orbit.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's interesting. Well, we're gonna take a little different tack here. So, first of all, to everyone out there, want to welcome you to episode number 1 of Starfleet Tactical, which is really going to be about all things space combat. It's not going to just be Star Trek. And I'll start off with I'll totally throw a curveball at you. But Dale Simpson and I were, and Dale is the XO in our chapter of Starfleet International, the Star Trek fan club, which we found out we're launching with like 72 people, our chapter, which is like their all-time record. And when he told us, he was like, yeah, 72. Like the paperwork is overwhelming them. Because they got like a send out a form to everyone, whatever. But anyway, that's all good. So Dale is former Special Forces. And so the last part of what so we're going to get a little nerdy, Star Trek nerdy here, which of course we never do. But one of the things as we're going through it is the different parts of Starfleet you can be a part of, right? And you can, and one of them is like on any ship, there might be a contingent of Starfleet Marines or MACOs. And I don't, and I said, what? Wait a second. Because according to the canon, the MACOs were an Earth.
Yeah.
And Starfleet, quote unquote, was an Earth force. That's what MACOs were. That they had MACOs. Once the Federation was formed and there was a new multi-planetary Starfleet, MACOs were retired and there was something else, of which we have never had a canon explanation of what there was. I mean, you've never really seen anything like that. They've never really talked about it.
Actually, Star Trek VI, Operation Retrieve. They did a briefing to the president, but we didn't see the guys in the camo suits.
Colonel West, right.
Yeah.
Now we have a military designation in for traditionally naval-based chain of command. So that makes you think that, okay, well, he's a colonel, so he must be in some form of Marines or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to logically assume there is something. I said to Steve Parmley, the head of Starfleet, I said, MACO's like that doesn't make any sense. And he said, yeah, I know, it's legacy, whatever. So I said, okay. So Dale and I were talking about this yesterday, and so the conversation was, okay, so maybe when there's no war going on, there's a minimal number of Marines and they're mostly training and maybe they're available for special missions, whatever. In war, you have to have some sort of force. And also I'm like, well, also, it's now you're talking Starfleet has become a military organization, like it or not. In the 4 years war, Starfleet became a military organization.
Yeah.
So I said, so what is that for me? So is it Marines? Is that what we're talking about? And are those Marines stationed on every ship, like it used to be? I guess back in the British Empire in the day of sail. Maybe I'm wrong, but they used to have Marines on all the capital ships. And is that the way it is? And then, what are your special forces? And you got to have a lot of different special forces because there's a lot of different missions when you're talking an interplanetary war, not just it's not terrestrial based. So that's where I want to start the conversation and get your thoughts on what you think.
So that's about 3 days worth of conversation.
Well, we got plenty of time.
But the first thing I would ask is, why do we have all the different types of special forces? And the answer is because John F. Kennedy said to all of the services, you will have special forces. You will be special. And so when I was on the faculty of the Naval War College, I did the faculty by day, student by night thing. And one of my colleagues in the wargaming department there was a Navy SEAL. He was a reservist Navy SEAL on active duty. And Bill sort of, he made a name for himself writing, all of his papers were about the SEALs. And he ended up writing his master's project paper on getting rid of the Navy SEALs.
Wow.
And when he told me this, I said, Bill, in case you haven't noticed, you're a Navy SEAL. And his response was, he said, yeah, but in a lot of ways, most SEALs would be happier in the Army. And I said, that is an interesting statement that I do not understand. Would you please explain that to me? And the answer was basically, he said, look at what happens. If you want to be a SEAL, how do you go about being a SEAL? You join the Navy. So you have to, there's this article of faith that you can now make it. So you join the Navy. You have to hang around in the Navy for a period of time. Then you apply to be a SEAL. You might not get picked. If you get picked, you might flunk out. You might fail. At which point, now you're in the Navy. And if you're not going to be a SEAL, you probably don't want to be in the Navy. You probably want to be in the Army, right? And so his argument is basically the SEAL, all the different special forces have more in common with each other than they do with the service that they come from. If you had to link them up to a service, it's probably the Marines or the Army that you'd want to link them up to. because that's sort of the place where it makes the most amount of sense for them to fit. And, with those things in mind, it's like, one of the interesting things about Space Force is that if you wanted to create a sixth service, you could make the argument that Special Operations Command is ahead of Space Force in terms of what should be the sixth service, because they already have acquisition authority. That's a big deal, right? If the Navy SEALs need something, they don't go through the Navy to get it. They have their own acquisition authority. They're, in a lot of ways, SOCOM functions like it's a sixth force anyway.
Explain what SOCOM means.
Special Operations Command.
Yes. Right. Okay.
And SOCOM sits above all. Is it just Tier 1 or all special forces?
Well, they're as I understand it, I mean, everything with SOCOM has an asterisk next to it. So it's one of those places where you could have a general understanding that's not correct when it comes to them. And I'm not an expert on SOCOM by any stretch of the imagination, but they are the force provider for everybody else. And as a result of that, of having that being the force provider to everybody else, they actually have, as I understand it, more control, more operational control than is normal for forces that are provided to a combatant commander, because they're special. Everything about them is special. And in part because there's just, there's some classification issues associated with it and other things like that. Now, I should emphasize at this point that I do not speak for the Department of Defense or any past, present, or future employer, blah, 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 blah. And this is special operations is not my Jeopardy category by any stretch of the imagination. But that's my understanding of it.
Yeah. I've only worked for a SEAL, but I don't have a lot of in-depth knowledge, but I did have a SEAL as a boss once.
Right.
SEALs are crazy as a general rule, but it's oftentimes a good kind of crazy.
Yeah, I like it.
I do too, but when I say they're crazy, it's because they're literally people who have a different definition of what's possible and what's not possible. You don't become a SEAL if you understand what no means. You just don't.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a real advantage. Occasionally, it's not an advantage. Usually, it's an advantage because they just got a totally different definition of what the art of the possible entails. And my former colleague, the Navy SEAL, his comment was always, special forces is SOF is a state of mind. That is what differentiates them. It is not the fact that they get all this extra training or the fact that the Navy SEALs have a bigger training ammunition budget than the United States Marine Corps does. It's not the fact that they're like training 7 hours a day, et cetera, et cetera. It's the fact that their mindset is just so different from the others. And that's part of the reason why you pull them together in Special Operations Command, is because, I mean, this is not how he described it, but this is sort of my view from looking in, is that like, you don't want the other guys contaminating them, and you don't want them contaminating the other guys.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. And the only, one of the things from, when I've heard SEALs talk and stuff like that, one of the things they talk about is just going through the training. It's very difficult. A lot of people quit and stuff, real high washout rate. But one of the things they said is, you've got your boisterous, aggressive, pounding his chest, openly, how would you say it? The loud guy who, I got this, I can do it, all that kind of stuff. Those aren't the guys that make it. It's the quietly determined people in many cases. Yeah.
So somebody in the stream said something about pararescue being pretty good. And I once asked one of my colleagues when I worked at CNA, he had done a bunch of work with the SEALs and like he had been at SOCOM for a while. And I asked him, like, which group do the other special forces look up to? The other soft guys, who do they look up to? And he said, oh, it's the PJs. It's the pararescue jumpers for the air. And I thought, really? The Air Force guys? And it's like, yeah, their training pipeline was twice as long as anybody else's training pipeline. And if you think about what their mission is, the mission is to drop one or two of them behind enemy lines, where they find the down pilot, give them, pick the guy up, and while conducting a running battle, egress from the area while also providing the guy first aid. So
that's impressive. Okay,
that's a David Weber character.
So what is that? So let's transfer this to a Starfleet situation. What do we think? Because now we don't have necessarily different branches of service, right? It's all Starfleet, really. You're not dealing with Air Force, Marines, Army, Navy. You're dealing with Starfleet. But, you could argue that the special forces needed are even more varied than they are in current day terrestrial SOCOM, let's say.
Mm-hmm. You'd have different environments to work in.
Yeah.
That's just one thing. Lots of different environments.
Absolutely. And then how would those forces be deployed as well? That's another thing. That's another question. So any thoughts on that? Because we could start making a list of all the different jobs special forces in Starfleet would have.
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts that come to my mind right away. One is that, as my friend Brian McHugh says, the science that makes Star Trek science fiction is management science, because they're just incredibly well managed, and everybody's an A-list performer and totally and completely motivated all the time, et cetera, et cetera. Starfleet really is basically, it's an entire organization of special forces guys. They're all A-list performers. They're all just fantastic, et cetera. And you could probably say training science also, in terms of like, you never run into anybody who just isn't picking it up, right? They all seem to be incredible A-list performers. That can kind of be summarized. The second point I'd make, that can kind of be summarized in the way that that my friend Winchell Chung summarizes it, which is the people on Star Trek only look like they're human. So with that as sort of a context for it, boy, those guys are good.
Well, we do see them. I mean, this would kind of reinforce Chris's point a little bit, I guess. But we see them pull our main characters off of starships. Picard got taken out of command of the ship. They pull Worf and the Doctor, and suddenly they're now in doing some special ops training. So we do see that, and we do see ground forces. We see at least 2 episodes with ground forces. So it's possible those could be ship security. We don't know if they're just regular crewmen being beamed down to planets to try to hold a planet. But I suspect there's got to be some you got to have some dedicated ground forces there.
Right.
It might be a really small group, because you're probably not just doing giant invasions. You're probably doing very surgical type, when you beam down to a planet. I didn't get the impression there were massive armies moving around unless you were just occupying a planet.
The farther away you were from the core Star Trek story, the more likely it was that it was just something that was created for that particular episode without any sort of thought about continuity or anything like that. I mean, that should not be interpreted as a criticism of Star Trek. It's just a statement of reality about the fact that it was a television show. And that's sort of how it is. And our colleague Andy Presby, he's famous for saying, I can retcon that. And Pat and I were talking earlier today about how, yeah, you can say that. It was either today or yesterday. You can say that, but that isn't necessarily always true or always a good thing, because sometimes what you'd really want to do about something like that, if you want to try to make everything consistent and fit together nicely, sometimes the right answer is just to pretend that something didn't happen. because once you sort of like have to explain it within the context of everything else, you end up going to very weird places.
Right.
And so I get a little hesitant when we start talking about ground forces in Star Trek, just because I don't think that any of them, and by them I mean the writers, I don't think any of the writers really sat down and did some thinking on that. I'm not sure that they really sort of understand how that works. And this is sort of the place where, like, one of the things that Bu9 tries to do in the Honorverse in situations like that is we try to figure out what the right answer is or should be, and then we go to David and say, this is what we propose. And hopefully we get there before he does. Because sometimes if he's already gotten there, then it's like, no, you got to make it work with this other idea that I've had. But we try to sort of figure out where David is going to go in that universe so that we can figure stuff out and sort of go, okay, this is how we think that this works. This is why it makes sense to do it that way. Does that work for you?
I also think, the taking another crack at this, we actually started I started a conversation with someone else just about officers versus enlisted crew in Starfleet. Yeah. Because we rarely even touched on that in Star Trek, but we know Miles O'Brien is a chief.
Yeah,
he's
the only chief in Starfleet we've ever actually confirmed.
if you go and do a search for him, if you go and Google him, somewhere out there's an article that basically makes the argument that we really can't determine anything based on him because he's all over the map. They treat him very inconsistently. His rank insignia seems to be just like randomly drawn.
It changed over time, but towards the end of DS9, it was actually like little chevrons and stuff like that on the pin. So it did eventually change. I try to go with the latest evolution and just say, okay, that's what I saw all along.
But they never really define exactly what it is that a chief does. Now, generally in modern U.S. Armed Forces, you've got, I'm trying to think of the word. Usually when the Navy uses that, somebody just said that he looks like he's a warrant officer. And I was just about to say, usually when the Navy uses the term chief, they're talking about a warrant officer usually, right? Or am I wrong on that, Pat?
You're wrong on that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. You're right. I'm wrong on that. I'm hanging out with the Air Force people too much now, and it's bleeding over because I think that's generally
we have chiefs, senior chiefs, and master chiefs. So
yeah.
But now the one episode that I actually, and I just happened to have recently watched it. We don't have to steer the entire thing into this direction, but the episode Starship Down, they very distinctly had enlisted crewmen in there. The chief was leading them, and things were being filtered from Worf to the chief to the enlisted guys. Where Worf, O'Brien's trying to explain to him, hey, these guys didn't go to Starfleet Academy. They're not even ensigns, because usually the writers just assume the lowest rank is an ensign, of course, and everybody's an ensign,
right?
Which was an explicit. Sometimes it's tough to tell when Roddenberry would give an answer to something as to whether he was just making shit up on the spot or whether it was something he had actually thought through.
Right.
He was explicitly asked, why don't we ever see any enlisted? And his response was, they're all astronauts, so they're all officers. And which then becomes problematic when you start dealing with O'Brien. And I thought there was actually, I got sort of mixed up there because wasn't there some other term that they always used to use for O'Brien other than just chief?
No, pretty much they've always called him chief. And someone just says there's evidence of enlisted crew, and I tend to agree with that. I think that many of the writers just didn't get it, and so we just don't see it in many of the episodes. Yeah. I assume it's there because if you think about how big Starfleet Academy has to be, if 400 to 500 people per ship. All
That
went
was
to
just
Starfleet
about to be
Academy.
my next comment. Yeah,
Times 8,000 ships or whatever it was. I know there was some fan-made publication that assumed around 8,000 ships. So we'll go with that. Starfleet Academy has to be enormous. The Naval Academy is about, I believe, about 4,400 midshipmen. That means the Naval Academy is graduating about 1,100 people per year. And that's to support, and that's to support what? 250 ships in the Navy, Chris? I don't know what the current number is, but I think it's under 300.
Yeah, it is under.
Is it really? Whatever happened
Yeah.
to the 600 ship Navy?
Oh, that was the 80s. We never even got there, I don't believe.
We didn't quite make it.
Yeah, I mean, made a good strong effort, but so the point is, if you multiply out how big Starfleet Academy, they have to have a lot of ROTC campuses all around the Federation, because that academy, the ground, I mean, it would require like the better part of San Francisco.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's I'm sure that there is there's Starfleet Academy, and then there are ancillary academies, satellite academies as well. There has to be, just to your point, or else you're distributing, because there has to be hundreds of ships in Starfleet at certainly at the time we're talking about during the 4 Years' War.
Yeah, 4 Years' War, I assume maybe Starfleet's only in the several hundred ships kind of range or something like that.
This is a good point. Alistair makes a good point here. In regard to the movies, there's a uniform distinction between officers and enlisted personnel.
There are. Yep, there are. And later on in Next Generation, once they kind of got the uniforms figured out, you could tell the difference between officer uniforms and enlisted uniforms a little bit. Basically, the enlisted uniforms became the old polyester uniforms that they stopped using.
Yeah, that's the way it should. And right, and they should have. Again, these are things that they didn't have a consistent thought process behind it. But so we can probably agree that there's in Starfleet there are enlisted personnel. By the way, I've seen everyone saying, I seem to remember. Look, guys, unless you can give us a citation to an episode, we're not going to go with speculation here. We've got to go back, watch your episodes, and come back to us next Saturday.
Yeah, and
there's only 700, so by next week you should have it all done.
That having been said, I everything I've seen come across there is probably accurate, because I don't think the writers, I don't think that they necessarily were tracking everything.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting.
Oh, that's a very interesting little stat. Yeah. I don't remember seeing that.
That's cool. So we can agree that, and why we're doing this is we're kind of building this all out for the canon of Axanar and the 4 Years' War. We want to set something down and really make sure that this is all set down in paper. So we can agree that there's enlisted personnel. We probably need to be coming up with ranks for these enlisted personnel.
I don't know what. So I know what the basic distinction between enlisted and officers in the modern U.S. military is, and I know the history of how this is sort of, it fundamentally goes back to nobility versus commoners. And at some point that sort of morphed into sort of an education level thing, with the idea that with education came greater responsibility. I don't know how that fits into Star Trek. And, when I look at like Miles O'Brien, is it, I suspect in Star Trek, it's really, they talk about enlisted, but I suspect it's more along the lines of technical specialists. Because one would expect that in the Federation, pretty much everyone has as much education as they want.
Yeah. Well, they addressed it in the episode "The Drumhead," where there was the enlisted guy, the crewman. They referred to him as crewman. He became a medic, and he had chosen not to go to Starfleet Academy because he was so anxious to get into space. So it was clearly a faster route to Starfleet. But that was from the Drumhead. I can't remember the character's name.
Yeah, I remember.
he was half Romulan and he lied on his entrance exam.
Yep.
Or form. So yeah, I think they've definitely got it, and I think you're right. It's probably comes down to a little bit less, some less training or just far more specialized training.
Yeah.
But even officers in Starfleet clearly seem to have have specialty tracks too, whereas in the United States Navy, officers are generally expected to be very much generalists for the most part.
So Jim Westbrook just had something about O'Brien referred to himself as chief specialist. That's where I was going earlier with that chief thing, is that sounded an awful lot more like a warrant officer thing. It didn't sound like something the U.S. Navy has.
Yeah, I'm sure there's been some evolution to it, in 300 years. It wouldn't be exactly like we have it here in the United States.
So tell me what are the enlisted ranks in the 4 different services here in the United States?
So in the Navy, you'd have seaman recruit, seaman apprentice, seaman, petty officer 3rd class, petty officer 2nd class, petty officer 1st class, chief, senior chief, master chief.
So 9 ranks.
Yep. And then within each of those are sort of your ranks, okay? But then the Navy has a thing called a rate for the enlisted people, and that rate is their job specialty.
Gotcha.
Like you can have an armorer, a sonar tech, you name the kind of job that you need. It can be, a cook. It can be an admin, a yeoman, basically an admin specialist, personnel specialist, you name it.
Okay.
So, and there is a long list of those.
Right. So one's your authority and one's your specialty.
So the way you would write out, like if I were to abbreviate someone's rank in the Navy, and it tends to be different from all the other services. All the other services tend to get confused by the Navy. But like, it would be PO3, Petty Officer 3rd class. But we end up kind of working their rate into their rank. It's kind of this, we just kind of mix them together. So it would be like a Petty Officer 1st class who's a yeoman it's abbreviated YN. And so we would abbreviate them YN1. And I would very often call the person, hey, YN1, I need this, or YN1 Smith, I need this, please. And, so our rank structure is a little different. It's, Wikipedia would probably show you a pretty accurate, just list right there. But it is different from the Army and the Air Force.
And every now and then the Navy brass will try to change like how people are addressed or something like that. Pat's laughing because there was a firestorm, about 6 or 7 years ago?
No, three years ago. I was at my little command in Germany when that all started up. Yeah.
And so they tried to change things, and there was torches and pitchforks and shit like that.
Yeah. It was a quiet little mutiny.
Yeah. And I forget what ended up happening.
I believe they just made the idea because at some point the idea just disappeared. But I was never involved in any of that decision making, so nor did I go looking too deep for it. And
I wasn't buried in a Navy organization at the time, so I didn't have to pay attention to the stuff like that.
So, but I know my chiefs and my enlisted folks were not particularly appreciative of it for the most part. So. But yeah. So you want to figure out a little bit of, would they have had what kind of ground forces and special forces might they have had around 2245? So
yeah, right. And I guess and the reason we started on enlisted and officers is because I think that's a we're really looking at military organization as a whole. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's make sure we understand this before we start saying about what our special forces are. Mm-hmm. What is everything else? So and I'm just going to pull this up here because I found it. But here you go.
Yep, there you are.
So this is a nice handy chart.
Yep. There'll be a test by the end of this.
Okay, now put your hand over it and yeah. So so there you are. So
To
basically,
make that even more fun.
Yeah.
Or
if you look at the top of that chart, it has E1, E2, E3, E4.
Yep. Yeah.
And then it goes into officers 01, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The point there is that regardless of what we call you, that represents essentially your base pay.
Right.
So, as we
right. So there's some consistency there.
Yep.
And even if you've got the same rank as another service, it's not abbreviated the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
An Army lieutenant colonel is abbreviated differently than an Air Force lieutenant colonel is abbreviated differently from a Marine lieutenant colonel. And so it's one of those things that'll just trip you up. So this is why I have all that stuff written down, and I always double check it, just because, you know, you want to get that stuff right.
So I have a thought, anyways, just an initial thought as far as like ground forces and stuff, is I don't believe in the Romulan War, is there any canon or beta canon anywhere that indicates that there was any kind of ground combat during that war?
Not during the Romulan War. We've never heard of that.
Because I
don't remember anything per se from the two novels.
Mm-hmm. Because I was just thinking that I would assume that would influence to some degree, if they needed it in the last war, would influence how much of an organization, how seriously they took that as a possibility. I got to assume your average Andorians would be part of some ground forces, if there was one. So it could be that there are certain certain planets or members that more likely to contribute to that sort of thing.
Also, and I also think that when ground forces would be like the ships, because in the 4 Years' War, we still posit that the ships are segregated. That the races are, Andorians on their ships and Vulcans on there. It's all Starfleet, and it all may, but the name, the
fully integrating would take some time. Yeah,
exactly. Because even in TOS, it's still, Spock was the first Vulcan in Starfleet Academy.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also thinking that in the special forces, that wouldn't be the case. You're like, you know what? I want an Andorian because those antennae pick up wavelengths that, the human ears don't pick up, let's say.
Yeah.
So even though we're all going to be using special equipment and everything, there's, and maybe there's, you want Vulcans because, I would think you would want a team that has some combination of talents on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Enterprise, I believe we at least saw some Vulcan security types that seemed pretty good at the whole tracking people and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure that there were some that are adaptable to that. Yeah.
So anyway, that's just. So what do you think? Just to kind of tap off the first conversation, what do we think the names of these ranks would be? These enlisted ranks, would they be crewmen?
We hear people being referred to as crewmen in TOS and Next Generation throughout the time. So I think that's probably a starting place. That might be like a generic, like petty, like saying petty officer or something. And that could very well be. I mean, crewman is the thing we hear pretty frequently.
Right.
Or frequently enough.
We basically hear about crewmen and we hear about chiefs. So I think we know that there's at least two ranks, and it would also not be unreasonable that these ranks were segmented as they are, in a terrestrial forces. But it's also possible that 9 is just too much. It's like, well, maybe there's only 6.
Because I assume in their perfect little world, pay is not a real big deal. So,
right.
And some of those are obviously they're steps of authority and stuff like that, and extra responsibility. But how many pay grades you actually need, you might consider the fact that an organization as big as, let's say, if we had Starfleet at 8,000 ships, that organization might actually need more. Because you're talking lots of different tiers of, and I'm just spitballing, I'm just making this up as I go right now. But, we have 350,000 people. You tend to make a pyramid organization, and
this is where your ratings come in too, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, we know right off the bat that Starfleet breaks it down into command, science, and engineering.
Right. Well, and the other thing
operations, we should call red operations.
The other thing we also know, though, in modern U.S. Navy, that seems to be a big difference, at least by all the evidence we've seen on screen. Modern U.S. Navy is an up or out organization. I either promote or I get the hell out and make room for the next guy, which makes a lot of sense from a continuity of people. You bring in a certain number of people every year. You have a certain number of people leaving every year, and people move through their career path in their lifetime and stuff, and it works. Because if you were to allow somebody to hold command of an Arleigh Burke destroyer for 10 or 15 years, you've just held up the job and career progression for all the people behind him. And Starfleet seems to do that. Maybe they only make certain special exceptions, but Starfleet seems to do that a lot in the show.
Now, I think this is a reasonable attempt at creating some enlisted ranks there.
Yeah.
So
that's definitely yeah.
So Scott, do me a favor, email that to me, and we'll bat it around internally. But I kind of like that list. That list is kind of interesting. So it's a touche for that.
Just remember, third class is the lower rank, then second class is a higher rank, then first class is the next higher rank. I think I saw the numbers transposed there, but no big deal. But it looked good.
Yeah. Yep. Let's. Okay. I hope the term for a Space Force personnel would be a space enforcer. That sounds kind of Judge Dredd to me. Okay, so we kind of tackled enlisted and officers. So let's get back to the idea of ground forces. Are we comfortable with the idea of Marines as your ground forces, or is there is there an entirely separate entity from Starfleet under which ground forces would be?
It's always interesting. You don't see it nearly as much when you start talking about the Earth side of things, but you definitely see it in the Vulcans, right? There's these indications that there's basically a parallel Vulcan military organization.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
And so that implies the existence of that implies that Federation member worlds might have forces that are basically local, like U.S. states have forces that are local. We call them the National Guard, like the Iowa National Guard or the Ohio National Guard or whatever. And it sort of implies that maybe there's something like that also. And so I could easily see a situation where the Marine is a term that refers to Starfleet, Starfleet personnel, but maybe somebody somewhere has an army or something else.
Well, I mean, we know that they've got security on board the ship. The traditional name from Earth would be Marine for that, right?
Well, or Master at Arms.
Yeah, or Master at Arms. Yes, exactly. But that is that can be a very specific training path based on what we specialty in the show, what we see in the show. So, what you call them, could shift a little bit, but they refer to it as security there. Because the idea, I mean, what are Marines are offensive shock. The United States Marine Corps is offensive shock troops, for the most part, right? I mean, they get sent into some fairly tough situations. That would not be the tradition I think you want to inspire in a Starfleet organization. They're defensive in nature, right? You're protecting your landing parties, you're protecting your ship. You go on away teams and handle what you need to so their mission is different. I don't believe they're a spaceborne force, drop ships and all that kind of stuff. I don't see them as an invasion force.
It's always struck me as funny that they mix the tactical officer and the internal security officer,
right?
For two different reasons. One is in most of the cases that you see, I think in Next Gen, or at least a large number of those cases, if you had a need for one, you might have the need for the other at the exact same time. And so it's not like this guy can do it as a second hat. And the other thing that always struck me weird about that is that they're really kind of unrelated jobs, right? One is about it's like saying that the local cop and the guy who launches the nuclear missile are going to be the same guy.
Right. Yeah, right. It's like your fighter pilot is also the guard for the admiral's door. Right. I mean, you're mixing entirely different types of, on the show, they tend to mix specialties, right? I mean, you see this in quite a few sci-fi shows too, right? Like being a fighter pilot is a very specific skill set that you got to spend a lot of time working on if you want to be good at it and not get killed the first time you do it. But so is being able to be in a gunfight and doing that kind of stuff. And it seems to me if you send your pilots down on special forces type missions, well, you've diluted their training in one area or the other. But there's only so much time in the day to train. So all that is time, money, and effort. So
was specifically a Space Above and Beyond reference.
That is a Space and Above and Beyond reference.
Yeah, that was kind of goofy.
But I mean, we kind of saw that in Battlestar Galactica. I think we even saw it in the old Black Sheep Squadron show, right?
Well, okay, but I think actually with all of these examples, you can actually come up without having to do a whole lot of contortions. You can come up with an explanation for that. Mm-hmm. The explanation for Space Above and Beyond and for Battlestar Galactica is actually pretty similar in that those were both organizations that had extreme manpower shortages. Mm-hmm. Battlestar Galactica especially, because they had taken such heavy casualties. They were understaffed to begin with. And, they actually talk about it at one point. It's like, how many Marines do we have left? 3, sir, or word to that effect. And it's like, well, hand a gun to somebody else, right? And that's how you end up with a lieutenant. At one point, you end up with a lieutenant as the XO of a Battlestar. It's because next man up, right?
Yep.
Same thing in Space Above and Beyond. They weren't really equipped to fight a war, and there was something about the jump drive that made that a lot of people had a very negative physiological reaction to it. And we were clearly back on our heels at that point. And they even talk about it a little bit. It's like, it's absolutely insane that we're sending you down as ground forces, but we're going to do it anyway because we literally don't have anybody else. Now,
and they were Marines who are at least initially trained as infantrymen.
Yes, and that's the other thing is every Marine is a rifleman, and that's when you get to Black Sheep Squadron, I think. And
that makes a little more sense. Yeah,
I want to come back to Space Above and Beyond in just a second, but with Black Sheep Squadron, you've really got a situation there where they're providing security for their own base. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, everybody grabs a gun when they need to. And, that you would expect there to be more guys around to do that sort of stuff. But part of it is, it's you end up providing your own security at some level. Going back to Space Above and Beyond for a second, that's really an example, I think, and I'll admit I've got it, but it's been a while since I've watched it. It's on the list of things to go and rewatch. But sort of looking back on it as a War College grad, the thing that immediately jumps out to me is maybe you need to be having the conversation about missions that you want to accomplish versus resources that you have to accomplish missions. Because there comes a point where it's just like, we don't have the capability to do that. And if we try to half-ass it, all we're going to do is get people killed, and we're still going to fail in the mission. And thinking back on that show, I get the impression that they were like, that there was some real sort of strategic problems there, that they weren't thinking it through, right? They needed to just say, you know what, we just can't do that. As opposed to saying, let's make our air wing combat ineffective. Let's make our squadron combat ineffective and open the carrier to possible attack by sending this handful of people down to the planet. Yep. So there's an ends means thing there that you have to kind of have that discussion.
Yeah. So in Starfleet, we do see on multiple occasions them just yanking people off. There was Worf and Dax doing the real critical mission. There was the episode Lower Decks where they grabbed the young new ensign, who of course, I'll volunteer and do it, and she actually dies, because you can't kill a main character for volunteering. When they volunteer, it's all got to work out well. And she dies. She does what she's told, and wow. And so some of those clever little plans don't work.
And also in the time of TOS or TNG, they're not at war, so we're dealing with a different situation. Yep. In the 4 Years' War, we're dealing with a situation where we've got to assume that, that's part of the war thinking. In the beginning of the war, what do we got to do? Well, we got to make sure that our ships are. What about boarding actions? What about who's going to do that, right? Yeah. It's not security. So your red shirts are security. That's like you said, one of you said before, I think it's Chris. It's like that's your police officers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Those are your cops. Those are the guys who are keeping the place safe. They're not going to go breach the hull of another ship and board it and clear compartments.
Let me ask you this: in the time of your, do you envision Klingons being big on boarding ships at this point? Because it wouldn't take the Feds long to figure out that, oh yeah, we need a few more red shirts on board, or whatever color the shirts are at the time. It wouldn't take them long to get some reports back like, yeah, now I don't know if the Klingons beam aboard or they have, boarding shuttles that they tend to slam into the hull, breaching pods, I guess, if they have some equivalent of that in the old times.
Well, I think you have to then talk about what are the origins of the war and how long did it take to get into this war?
Right.
How long was it a Cold War? Or how long was it warm? And you were just like, you know what? We better get ready because this is not going to end well for us. Right. I think there are different things. And I don't know what the analogs are that you want to refer to here, terrestrially. Well, but I think I think Starfleet was probably in a situation. I think one of the ways I look at it is I kind of look at it as Starfleet in the situation of the United States just before World War II, and that this is Chris. This is probably your expertise, but we went from the Arizona and the Texas and those battleships to some pretty. How fast did we get the? Was it the Iowa class? What is the class?
Iowa came into, well, all those ships were authorized before the war. So we had the North Carolinas when the war started. South Dakotas came in after that. In fact, there's one of the battles in Sutherland's is the battle between Washington and South Dakota versus Hiroshima. I always describe that as Washington versus Hiroshima versus South Dakota, because Hiroshima fired on South Dakota and Washington fired on Hiroshima, but at no point did Hiroshima fire on Washington. And South Dakota gets hit early on, and ends up. I think it was a hit that tripped all of her breakers.
It lost all power.
Yeah, because they had set up the breaker system wrong. They had made a mistake, and as a result, they tripped all their breakers and they lost all power for a while. And on the one hand, you sort of look at it and go like, these guys are buffoons, right? Well, not so fast. The thing that most people don't know about that battle is that was literally South Dakota's shakedown cruise.
Wow.
So for her shakedown cruise, they sent her to a battle.
And which battle was this?
One of the Guadalcanal battles, one of the Earth Element battles. You do a search for Hiroshima and Washington. It's November of 42, if I remember correctly. One of those battles. And so, it's like once I heard that, I was willing to give South Dakota a pass, because normally you spend, a couple of months working up. And they didn't get a chance to do that. They were like a new crew just assigned to the ship, and they got sent in to do this job, and they got thrown right into the meat grinder.
And what was the result of that battle?
The result was, so Washington hit on her first salvo, which is next to impossible.
That never happens.
And Washington was a modern fast battleship, and Hiroshima was an old World War I era battle cruiser that had been upgraded to a battleship by welding a bunch of armor on. And so it was really the last generation technology. And Washington sunk Hiroshima. And when I was in graduate school back in the late 1980s, and I think I've still got the notes somewhere, there was a guy who was a gunner on Washington who came to the University of Maryland, where I was at grad school, and did a talk on this.
Oh, wow.
About how they did basically their gun boss had said, yeah, we're not going to use the book. I've got a better system.
You're not going to use the what?
The book. So their system was totally different than what Navy doctrine said to do. And they hit on the first salvo.
Damn.
And he said, once we got back to Pearl Harbor afterwards, first of all, they rewrote the book, and now our system was the one. And basically he said they spent the next like 3 weeks visiting every ship, teaching them, okay, here's how we do it. And teaching them how to do it. He said they were really, really busy because they had to teach everybody how to do it.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So, so I think the point I was making before was that we had a lead up time to get prepared for the war.
Yeah.
With the Klingons. Yes, we have these lofty ideals, and Starfleet is all about exploration, this and that. But at some point, we're like, there's incursions, there's conflicts. There's the Klingons are testing us. We're not idiots. We're not sitting back, go, oh yeah, we'll work this out, right? There are people in Starfleet going, guys, this shit could hit the fan, and we are or are not prepared, or we need to get prepared. And here's what we need to be doing. And so, just like as you said, maybe the Iowa class, the North Carolina, was on the drawing boards in World War II. That was, and that's kind of how I see the classes of ships that we're seeing that we've put out there. I see those as the first war generation ships. Mm-hmm. In the 4 years, like these ships were introduced in the beginning of the 4 Years' War, whereas like the Markland class was an old, right?
Yeah,
that was an old ship, right? And that quickly worked its way out of the rotation. So there's that. So that's kind of where we start thinking about, okay, so what are the ships that are in the war?
People always get stuff wrong at the beginning of a war,
right?
There's a saying that the generals prepare to fight the last war. So that's bullshit. It's not true. It's not true at all. What really ends up happening is you don't have current experience to draw from. What you have is what you've projected forward from the last time you have experience, with all the new stuff that you've been working on in the interim, right?
Right.
So it's not that like in World War II that they thought it was going to be like World War I. It's that they projected forward. They made predictions on how things had changed since World War I. and they didn't always get it right. So that's one factor. The other factor is there's always a political reality in terms of what you can and can't do. The French are the perfect example of this. You know, like people look at the Maginot Line and say this was a really bad idea. Well, realistically, the French political system was set up in such a way at that time that they couldn't conscript forces for a long enough period of time to really get them trained. They started off, if I remember correctly, with 2-year-long conscripts, and then they later turned into 1-year-long conscripts. And if you talk to anybody who's in the military, a 1-year conscript is next to useless, because you spend 6 months training them, and after 6 months they know how to tie their shoes, and then there's like 1 day where they're a full performance guy, and then immediately after that they're a short timer looking to get out. And so I see Pat nodding on this. And so, but that's what the system was. So the French were forced into this situation for political reasons. The army couldn't get what it needed, so they said, all right, then the only way this works is if we're fighting out of prepared positions. So the regular army will be the mobile force that will be behind the prepared positions, prepared to deal with whatever they have to deal with, you know, to support the prepared positions, and will create the Maginot Line because anybody can fight from a prepared position, regardless of what their experience level is. And so, was it the right answer? It was the best answer of the list of reasonable possible answers.
Yeah, and the French army was actually larger than the German army, I believe, before the Germans came across. One of the differences was the French tanks, they were infantry support. So they didn't have armored divisions and infantry divisions. They had, you know, groups of infantry with a tank or two in support. And so you got the word, you couldn't take advantage of the tank's mobility and firepower and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure it was great if they got into an infantry fight, but meanwhile the tanks were, you know, running behind your lines and creating havoc and stuff like that. So,
well, listen, we are at the end of our time for tonight.
Oh,
this is going to be an ongoing conversation, but I think we laid some good groundwork because for stuff that we can start this week. I'll put some ideas down on paper, some of the thoughts that some of our fans have made, and we'll start coming up with something that eventually I'd love to come up with a simple document that we can incorporate into the Axanar technical manual.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it will go from what they perceived the threat was going to be going forward. You know, like Chris said, you know, how much lead up time are you envisioning that sets up the war? Because I've still only seen the 20-minute documentary myself, so I don't know how much Cold War period there was or how often but yeah, their perception of the threat would dictate how many resources they throw at it. And, you know, maybe it's security on the ship. Maybe they did have a mobile ground force with some troop transports. So a quick reaction force would not be out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right.
Because you also have to deal with pirates also. Even if you're not dealing with Klingons, there's still pirates and criminal activity.
I'm sure there are. Yeah. No, I agree. All right. Listen, everyone, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our guests here, Chris Weuve and Patrick Doyle of U9. They are, which is the think tank for David Weber and his Honor Harrington series of books, which you should be reading if you're not, they're pretty awesome. And we will be covering that in the near future. We will be back next Saturday and every Saturday for your Saturday night space combat on Starfleet Tactical. Any questions you have, I urge you to friend Patrick or friend Chris on Facebook, and then you can bother them during the week if you need to, or ask them questions that we then discuss here on Saturday nights. But this is the regular Saturday night show from now on. Want to thank you all. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Patrick. You guys have a good week.
Before you sign off, there's one last thing I just thought of.
Yes.
So on Thursday, from this coming Thursday, June 4th, from 7 to 10 p.m. ish, the United States Naval Academy Museum is going to host something called NavyCon.
Oh, yes.
And it's going to be basically a bunch of short talks by various people talking. Now, if you go and you do a search for NavyCon, you can see the one they did in 2017. It's up on YouTube. My favorite presentation of that was the one that a Navy captain did on the Death Star as an acquisition program. And here's the hero of our story, Orson Krennic, who delivered on time and under budget. And so it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's got some like serious naval analyst stuff doing it. It's going to be pretty good. The registration information is going to go up tomorrow on the NavyCon USNA Facebook page. So I ran into some. There was a lot of friction in my life today, and I didn't get that up. I wanted to have all that information up so that I could point people to it and so I could put it in the notes, and I didn't get that done. So check Facebook, the NavyCon page tomorrow, and it should have the connection information up as soon as I can get it up tomorrow morning.
Awesome. Yeah. And that is Thursday, you said?
Thursday, the 4th from 7 to 10-ish p.m. Eastern time.
All right. Well, we'll have to follow up. Maybe you and I can chat. Maybe we can do a little post-mortem of NavyCon in our nightly show.
Sounds good.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much. Please be safe out there, even safer than before. Let's be wise. I know I hear we have a curfew in downtown Atlanta, but please be safe. And we'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye.